Welcome to Rethinking Communication. I'm your host, Michael Ashford. Come with me on a journey as I explore how we better connect with each other through the power of our words. For most of us, formal education left gaps in our ability to communicate well with each other, especially when trying to navigate conflict, inspire change, and overcome misunderstandings. I'm a former journalist, a speaking coach, and a communication expert, and my goal is to encourage you to rethink what it means to be an effective communicator, from the stage to the meeting room to the living room and everywhere in between. Have you ever been so frustrated that when you try to describe what you're feeling, you can only muster a shrug, a long sigh, and a shaking head? It's like your body is saying, I give up, I'm done, but you're not actually ready to say those words out loud to anybody. Well, a few weeks ago, I was on a Zoom call with a mid-level manager at a technology company, and that's exactly where she's at. She's at that place, wanting to say, I give up, feeling, in my own language, to use my own word, completely and totally exasperated. She's feeling this way because despite her best efforts to communicate her vision and her strategy to her team to help them meet their goals, she's not getting the breakthrough that she wants and she needs as the manager. She's spending too much time in the weeds of her team's daily tasks, explaining over and over again the same expectations, and then she's answering to her boss when deadlines are missed and she's not being, quote, strategic enough. And this is building a lot of just exasperation, anxiety, tension, all these things within her. And as she described her attempts to approve her communication to her team, her communication style, how she's communicating, what needs to be done, by when, setting those expectations. And to be fair, she's made several really thoughtful and well-considered tries at improving her communication. Something she said punched through the screen of that Zoom call like a shockwave. It hit me like a shockwave because once she said it, my communicative spidey senses redlined, like in a car when you press the gas pedal all the way to the floor and it just goes out of control. She said, how am I supposed to manage if people are hiding information from me? Now, what's going on here? Let's take a step back. You might think the words you use to describe what's happening around you and to you are just that, words that describe reality. You're using language to describe the reality of the situation around you. And it's true, saying the weather was beautiful on my run today and I felt so good. It just fresh, clear, crisp. I felt like I could run for another 6 miles. That's an accurate portrayal of my reality. But oftentimes, especially when we meet times of change, debate, conflict, our words become encoded with far more meaning than their literal definitions and the literal description of our reality, our perspective as we see it. Consider again what that manager said to me. How am I supposed to manage if people are hiding information from me? Hiding information from me. Those 4 words are not just a description of what she's experiencing or seeing. They also reveal a belief system and an ideological perception of the situation. Because in using this language, this manager assigned negative intent to her team's actions, suggested that the results are out of her control and therefore she can't be responsible for them, and they declared a certainty over the situation that casually shut down dissent. And perhaps most importantly, the language that she did use whispered, I'm the good one here, not them. They're the bad ones. They being her team. Now, the language itself, how am I supposed to manage if people are hiding information from me? She didn't say any of those things that I just shared with you. The assignment of negative intent, the suggestion that results are out of her control. declaring certainty over the situation to shut down anything that might contradict. Didn't say any of that in explicit language. Instead, it's a subconscious attempt to protect herself, with language meant to get others on her side and deflect blame. And I immediately, and after this conversation was over, I immediately thought of my conversation with Robin Reams here on episode 131 of this show, this podcast. Robin studies rhetoric. Rhetoric is the meta language to describe and explain how language works. And I want to read you this quote from Robin from that episode 131. We have a tendency to think about language as somehow providing this clear glass on the world, this clear glass on reality. And so consequently, we're not really aware of how, whether we know it or not, it's persuading us all the time. The way ideas get packaged, the way reality gets described to us, the way reality gets packaged to us, language is always working a kind of persuasive power on us. Now consider that. You might think the language, the words that you use are providing this clear view of the world, of the reality, of what's happening. And when we do that, when we fall into that trap, as Robin just said in that quote there, we become unaware of how the words that we use and the language that we use are communicating to us a message that is embedded within the words themselves. I don't think that manager even realized the covert meaning her words contained. And that's the point. You're almost always delivering a message beyond your words. And paying more attention to it makes all the difference when it comes to communicating well. So I want to ask you, consider, what message are you sending in the words that you're using? Because words matter. I think you probably know this. I think you are aware of this. But I'm curious how often this knowledge actually guides explicitly your word choice. I found that often we, and I'm including myself here, we speak or write without carefully considering the message within the message that we send out into the world, the language that we use. Consider the various ways one might talk about the business world. I use this all the time in a lot of my talks about communication whenever I stand on a stage and give talks. Sometimes business is described as a battle or a war. A lot of military language is used, where the competition must be defeated, and where work is done in the trenches and employees working with customers are on the front line. Let's go another direction. Others might suggest that business is more like a sport, and so we use that kind of language. Work is done by following a playbook. A manager goes to bat for an employee that deserves a promotion, and the Hail Mary attempts, those are used to bring an upset customer back from the brink, right? And still, there's another kind of language here. Some use the language of a playground when talking about their organization. Ideas are generated and tested in a sandbox, for example. You might tag in a coworker to help on a project, or one thought might piggyback off of another in a meeting with your team or your leadership, right? And it's not that every organization falls neatly into one of these categories. I've worked in organizations where all of this language is used, but think then about the work being performed in the various capacities where that language is used. How might people act in each one of these different language scenarios, even within the same company, but depending on the manager, depending on who's delivering the message with that language, how might people act? How might people respond to those messages, to that language? What might the unspoken expectations be with a manager that uses warlike language versus, let's say, a manager where playground language is used? I worked in sales and marketing at a company many years ago where warlike language was the norm in the sales and marketing team, and it's shocking how quickly you can begin to dehumanize the human beings who work at the competing companies, at the competition, the people that you gotta win the battle against, simply because they chose to work at a different organization. You begin to talk about them as if they are not human or worthy of respect or dignity when that language is so often used. The unspoken language beneath words, it permeates, it seeps into your thoughts and actions. And eventually, if you are not cognizant of it, if you are not aware of it, if you do not pay attention to it, that language starts to feel true. It starts to feel right. And it starts to feel like an accurate depiction of the situation, an accurate depiction of reality, your reality. And so, on the flip side, to someone else who uses different language, who has a different view, a different perception, those words might land as wholly inaccurate, unsubstantiated. That might kick off misunderstandings and conflict. The best communicators explore this gap more deeply than others. The words that you use versus the words that I use to describe the same situation and the meaning that is attached to those words underneath the language of the words themselves. Another example for you, I go back to episode 68 when I interviewed the documentarian filmmaker James Parker about his documentary in Oregon called Other Side of the Hill, where you had these groups from rural Eastern Oregon meet with folks from more urban Western Oregon, and the language that they would use to describe what many would categorize as climate change. When you listen to and listen to the language that is beneath those words that they would use, you have climate change or global warming on what would typically be called the left, the more liberal side, the more urban side, and then you have the language of environmental stewardship and taking care of the land that has been given or bestowed to us. You have these two sides talking about, both of them agreed that the land was changing, that the environment was changing in some ways for the worse, and there was no denying that things were changing for the rural folks, how their livelihood, how they built a living for themselves was changing. No longer was it, obviously you can think of them being very agricultural based in more rural areas in Eastern Oregon. And the language that they would use would be very much about taking care of the land and stewarding resources and wanting to pass down to the next generation the farmland and the resources and the knowledge that had been given to them for years and years and years. And you had people from Western, the more urban side of the state, talking about the need for environmental action and like I said, global warming and climate change. Because of the language, because of the ideology underneath both of those depictions or descriptions of both of those situations, they could not see that they actually agreed at the center that the climate and the land and the environment was changing and that something should be done about it. Now, it's fascinating because if you think about the language of climate change is often tied to left, liberal leaning ideology, and underneath that is one set of beliefs and values about what needs to be done, what should be done to combat climate change. And then you have on the other side, the more right-leaning, the more conservative or Republican side of things, you have a deep tie to not only the more rural side aspect of living, but you have faith and Christianity there. And the language that is underneath things like stewardship of the land, when you think about that, that is, we've been given rain, we've been given this land bestowed to us by a higher power, and it is our job and our duty to steward it well for ourselves, for our posterity, for others who come after us. It is the life that is given to us from the land. The ideology underneath that, because these two are pitted so often against each other, when we use that language, as it was used in this documentary that James Parker produced, it just creates this gap. And like I said earlier, it's that gap, that ability to speak to you in the language that you think makes sense, that resonates with you, not with what resonates with me, and not with what gives me my depiction of reality, but understanding and exploring what your reality looks like in the language beneath your words. That's where the best communicators live. They are constantly in this mindset of understanding or trying to ask the question, what else could be true here? During my conversation with the manager who shared that her team was hiding information from her, I encouraged her to set aside her certainty mindset over the situation and instead lean into her curiosity. I encouraged her to consider that question. What else could be true? Was her team really hiding information from her? And if she believed this, how had she communicated that concern to her team? What else could be missing? What could she be missing? As we discussed this situation and these questions started to arise, she started to use new language. As we considered these questions, rather than hiding information, well, perhaps the team was unsure about what to share, who to share it with, and when to share it. Maybe some employees were withholding information, but rather than it being intentional, what if they didn't even know that what they knew was important or relevant because nobody had told them, or they hadn't seen it documented in any way, or they hadn't been asked for it? Do you see how the language shifts from defensiveness to openness, from absolutes to nuance, from certain to curious? This shift goes against everything that you feel pulled to do, and yet it is the way to communicate well with others when our words can't seem to capture all that's at stake. There's another aspect to this as well, which is that great communication that runs counter to everything that you've been taught and pulled to do, feel pulled to do, that's been modeled, that's been incentivized in our culture. To communicate differently than that requires a change of your mindset, requires you to shed what you feel pulled to do and the way that you approach your goals in communication. A lot of times people will come to me looking at, maybe possibly getting into communication coaching, and their ask of me is, well, can you help me with what to say? And can you help me with, a framework or a structure of what to say in that moment where I'm being disagreed with, or that they're just not seeing it my way. And I want to be able to get people, on board with my ideas. Yeah, great. That's all possible. It's going to look very different than what you're thinking right now. The way that I teach communication and the way that I've seen it work out and play out in the business world for 2 decades now, in the coaching world, in coaching TEDx speakers, the talks that go quote unquote viral or get promoted by Big TED to a larger audience, like those talks approach the communication of their idea. Those communicators approach the element of change in human beings far differently than what they initially feel pulled to do. And it is because they have allowed themselves to change their mindset, their approach, that it is not about just getting others to go along with what you believe, feel, sense, see in some instances. It is opening yourself up to the possibility that other things exist here. And how can we explore that gap earlier that I said the best communicators sit in? The best communicators shift their mindset enough that they are comfortable living in that gap of, here's what I believe, but there are other possibilities, and I want to explore that gap. This is how you become a great communicator. It is a mindset shift far more than it is frameworks and structures on what to say and how to say it. It is a thoughtful consideration of your words and the meaning that you are placing, you are embedding within your words and your language It is a thoughtful consideration of that and how that might land with someone who sees it differently or experiences reality different than you. The great communicators don't take lightly the power of their words, the language that lies beneath those words, and their role in uncovering that gap. The great communicators are the bridge rather than the one who simply pulls someone else across that gap to their side. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Rethinking Communication. If you want a little bit of a guide on how to get more into this great communication mindset, this shift away, go to the links in the show notes. There is a link to download my free guide, The New Leaders Communication Playbook, get you set up with some of this. And then also, I've got a link in the show notes to actually watch a recording of a live session that I did on the New Leaders Communication Playbook. If you want to go watch that, you can download it, follow along, and watch at the same time. Also, you can learn more about my one-to-one communication coaching with that link in the show notes as well. Thank you so much for your time and attention. I do not take it lightly that you listen, and I know I haven't been as regular here on the podcast, but I am going to try to get back to it with a little bit more regularity. So thanks for sticking around. I appreciate you as always. If you ever want to get in touch with me, you can always email me at michael@rethinkingcommunication.com. And until next time, as always, keep asking questions.